It is the morning of September 25th, 2007. I'm Michael Aron of NJN News. This is the Rutgers project on the governor, the Brendan Byrne Archive. We're going to talk this morning to Harvey Fisher. Harvey was a State House reporter for the Elizabeth Daily Journal back in 1972, around the time Brendan Byrne started thinking about running for governor. He moved on to the Bergen Record around 1975. He would become State House Bureau Chief of the Record during the Byrne years. As it happens, he would later become the Executive Director of NJN Public Television. Today he is the editor of New Jersey Lawyer, the newspaper of the State Bar Association. We'll talk to Harvey about the Byrne years. Harvey, how did you get to the New Jersey State House in 1972? What had led you there?
I was working for the Elizabeth Journal, and the newspaper sent somebody else to the State House. And when I told the executive editor if that job ever comes open again, let me know. And he said, "Why didn't you tell me beforehand?" And that other person left after a while, and I was sent to the State House and stayed there for the Elizabeth Journal and then the Bergen Record as a newspaper guy until 1990.
How old were you in 1972?
Now you make me do some math. I was born in 1938. You figure it out.
So you were 34.
Could be.
Okay. And where'd you grow up?
Grew up in Brooklyn. I had my first job in Elyria, Ohio. And then I went to the New Haven Register, and then I came to the Home News in New Brunswick in 1965.
And then the Elizabeth Journal?
Elizabeth Journal was 1971, right around there.
What did you specialize in your early days as a reporter?
Urban affairs, and I covered almost every beat in my early days: local reporting, education reporting, some court reporting, covering city government, and urban affairs.
Where'd you go to college?
Brooklyn College.
Did you like reporting?
Loved it. Ate it up. There's an independent. Being a reporter, there's an independence that few occupations provide. Yes, you have editors over you, but you're the frontline guy. You're the guy out there asking the questions, not the editor. You're the guy, in most cases, determining what is the most important aspect of the interview or the event, and not the editor. That's a tremendous amount of independence.
Who owned the Elizabeth Daily Journal?
I don't recall the game show people, Goodson, Todson, something like that.
Was it an independent newspaper, or was it part of a group of newspapers, do you recall?
I think they had the Trentonian at the same time, roughly the same time.
What was the pecking order of newspapers back in those days? Which had the most clout, the most prestige?
Star Ledger. Everybody followed way behind that. It was not unusual. The word on the street, and I would find that it was correct by and large, that the word on the street was that the governors would check in with the executive editor of the Star Ledger on major issues, and that did take place.
Feed the Ledger, in other words, before the other papers would...
Right, but I'm talking about in terms of editorial policy. The governors would check in with the editor, the executive editor of the Star Ledger. Star Ledger, in my time, may have had 11, 12 reporters in Trenton, and they were all over the place. And they had the largest circulation. So, largest circulation, political clout, or through the association with the top editors of the paper. All that means that the Star Ledger would get stories that other papers didn't have. And the Star Ledger would often allow its editorial policy to filter into the news pages in terms of placement of stories. Having said all that, the Star Ledger was a paper you had to read.
What was number two?
Number two was probably the record, the Bergen Record. Record of Hackensack, closely followed or maybe even a tie with the Philadelphia Inquirer and its South Jersey coverage.
How about the New York papers in those days?
New York papers had clout. Brendan Byrne, probably Brendan Byrne, the campaign of Brendan Byrne got rolling because of the New York Times carrying these stories about a blue ribbon independent panel of 50 well-known people getting behind this judge named Brendan Byrne, and that carried forward.
Who were the key reporters when you got to the State House?
Ronnie Sullivan for the New York Times. Let me put it this way, instead of key reporters, the individuals, the key newspapers, or the big guys, the Daily News, New York Daily News, Ronnie Sullivan with the New York Times, the Associated Press, and of course the Star Ledger.
Okay.
Those guys would.
Did you think that Ronnie Sullivan and the New York Times went too far in pushing Brendan Byrne?
Pushing for?
Yes, pushing for
Brendan Byrne. Well, there was a senator out of Essex County named Ralph DeRose who was the early favorite to win the Democratic nomination, the early perceived favorite to win the Democratic nomination. Most people thought that he had some baggage at the time, right or wrong. They thought he had some baggage, and they were looking for somebody else. So the promotion of Brendan Byrne unfolded. Interestingly, after Brendan Byrne was elected, he didn't like some of the things Ronnie Sullivan for the New York Times was writing about him, and went up to the newspaper to complain about Ronnie Sullivan. So you had this one reporter who perhaps helped make Brendan Byrne, another reporter who wrote the same reporter who wrote negatively about Brendan Byrne.
Do you recall whether that had any effect on Ronnie Sullivan's coverage of Brendan Byrne? The complaint from
I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know. You have to get into a reporter's head to know what is turning him off or turning him on. And that, I never was able to get that.
All right, so you arrive at the State House in '72, the year before Byrne runs for governor. Who was Brendan Byrne at that time, and how quickly do you think you became aware of him when you arrived at the State House?
When I arrived maybe I was drawing blanks, and maybe I was too new, but I didn't know anything about Brendan Byrne. Yeah, he had a resume. He had been a prosecutor. Was a judge. Worked for the Public Utilities Commission. Not worked. He was perhaps chairman or president of the Public Utilities Commission. He had a resume, but meant nothing to me.
What's your first recollection of becoming aware of him? What's your earliest memory of him as a candidate or as a governor or as someone you encountered?
Sure. It's the day he came into the State House, marched into the State House with Jim Dugan, who was then, I believe, a Hudson County senator, and later would become state Democratic chairman. And I cannot recall the man's name, but from Bergen County, I think he was a Bergen County chairman, Democratic chairman. The three of them marched into the State House. It was like the second coming, if you will. The press was all over the place waiting for them to come in anticipation of this great announcement. And I was still relatively new then. I was amazed at what was taking place. He marched into the State House, big strides, at least that was my impression, my recollection of him. Went into the governor's office, and I believe at that point he announced, to Cahill, that he was resigning as as a judge, and because he was going to run for election for the Democratic nomination. It was an amazing day. It was almost like it was choreographed, but I don't think it was. And I think the press at that time was hungry for a new candidate. And of course, again, I wasn't tuned in. I'm still relatively new. Got to put that in perspective. Some of those articles about in the New York Times advancing this probably led to it. But
why was the press hungry for a new candidate, a new face?
They may not have liked. I don't really know. Again, there was some negativism about Ralph DeRose, that Essex County senator, who was early on perceived favorite to get the nomination. And that, I believe, that negativism filtered into the press ranks. And it was a fresh face, I guess. Brendan Murr was a fresh face, a alternative candidate.
Does the press always like fresh faces?
Oh, sure. Especially when somebody is perceived as a possible winner. The press gets tired of I'm talking generally right now. Right. The press gets tired of the same candidate seeming to be on the way to victory, and then when the possibility of somebody else coming into the race emerges, there's a contest. We in the press love contests. Otherwise, writing about an election gets boring.
What did the press think of Governor Cahill?
He was a feisty son of a gun. Gutsy guy. Went against the I can't talk about what the press thought of Cahill. I can give you my impressions. And again, I was relatively new. Gutsy guy, said what he wanted, didn't care what people thought, went against his own party in pushing for income tax, and loved a good time. Loved to have a drink every now and then, or maybe more. Loved to party.
What was the political climate at the time of Byrne arriving, the scene you paint? What was going on, either in the state or in the nation, that set the tone?
Watergate. And this relatively new reporter, again, I came to the State House in late 1972. This relatively new reporter is going to get a interview with Governor-elect Brendan Byrne. And by the way, since I was working for a relatively small paper, I was probably the last reporter to get an interview with Governor-elect Byrne. And during the course of that, I asked him what he thought about what was going on in Washington. And he said Richard Nixon should resign. And he was the first, to the best of my knowledge, chief governor or governor-elect anywhere in the nation to make that comment. And it turned out to be a pretty big story for me in the Elizabeth Journal, which of course went to, the story went to Associated Press, went across the country.
Did you get credit for that?
The Elizabeth Journal did, yeah.
That's a coup for a reporter.
It helped establish my standing. Elizabeth Journal was a small paper heading towards death. And that would happen 3 or 4 years. You could put your 2 fingers, your thumb and your forefinger on the paper, and you can almost squeeze them together. There wasn't much in the paper, other than, of course, coverage of the State House. So I would get some pretty good stories. It may sound egotistical, but I would get some pretty good stories. But for a reporter to have clout in the State House, you had to have something more than exposure in small papers like the Elizabeth Journal. So every time I got a good story, I would feed it also at the same time to the Associated Press with the understanding that the Associated Press would say the Daily Journal is what Daily Journal is reporting today. That gave me in my mind, that gave me the clout or standing I needed, because it wasn't just, oh, Fisher, story is going to die in the Elizabeth Journal. It's Fisher. When Fisher writes, it's probably going to be across the state. And my editors loved it at the Elizabeth Journal.
How did you like the State House your first year there as a beat?
It was a little bewildering. I remember there was a Hudson County Democratic operative. He'd been a former reporter for many years in New York, World Telegram and Sun, I believe. And one day he came walking through the halls, and I was new, and he whispered something in my ear. Great story. He was feeding me something. And then I watched him go down the same hallway and whispered something in every reporter's ear. It was fun. That was fun. You have to learn the ropes of the State House. It was a fascinating beat. Always something happening. I recall one speaking at Rutgers, talking about being a State House reporter, and I said a lot of the probably was with the Elizabeth Journal at the time, and I said most of the reporters concentrate on the first, second, and third story of the day. Me, I'm looking for 4, 5, and 6. That in 2 weeks is going to be 1, 2, and 3. Right? So that a lot of the reporters at the State House are just laying back and waiting for the news to come. Little did I know there was a State House reporter in the audience. Excuse me. And there was a lot of reaction to that.
What was Brendan Byrne like as a campaigner in 1973?
He got around a lot. He said all the right things. I hope I have the quote or something akin to the quote correct. He did not foresee raising taxes. He did not see any raise in taxes for the foreseeable future, I think, was foreseeable future, words that would haunt him in his first term, because within a few weeks after taking office, within just a few weeks after taking office, he was pushing for a income tax.
Did the press jump on him for that?
Press always jumps on the candidates who say one thing when they're running and then say the other thing, say the opposite when they're in office. But that's a constant.
Is that
not the press jumping, but it's a constant with candidates saying one thing when they run and something else when they're elected, doing something else when they're elected.
And it probably is a constant that the press jumps on it. We have the term flip-flop today.
Sure.
I don't know if that term was around back in the 70s, but it's the same phenomenon.
But there's another constant, and that is that if the candidate was candid when he was running, he probably would not get elected.
Uh-huh. Who is that? Were you surprised when Cahill lost the primary that year to Charlie Sandman?
I may have my figures wrong, but they're right in the ballpark. Cahill had been told that 20 of the 21 Republican county chairmen were behind him. It turned out in the election when the primary day came around, or just before that, 20 of the 21, well, almost all the county chairmen had turned on him. They were just giving him some lip service by saying they were with him. Some of us in the press had heard this. Again, I was still too new at that time to appreciate that this change is about to take place. That his own chiefs were turning on him. I didn't know. I would hear that, but I didn't know if that was true or not. Again, too inexperienced to understand that. Appreciate that.
Who do you remember interacting with besides the candidate back in the early days of the Byrne campaign or governorship, who was the key person, or who also sort of carried a big stick?
Well, Dick Leone carried a lot of import. Alan Sagner, who was a millionaire liberal who Byrne made the transportation commissioner, I believe had a lot of say in policy beyond transportation. What I'm giving you right now are perceptions. Other reporters may have other perceptions. And so you learn that if you're good, you may have 30-40% of knowledge of what's really going on. But it's the insiders who obviously have the real grip on things. So you're dealing with your perception. I'd have to think more about that.
Okay, well, it's interesting that Leone and Sagner are the first two that come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Back to the Republican primary.
Louis Caden, too, by the way.
Lou Caden, yeah.
Sure.
Back to the Republican primary of that year, 73. Once Sandman defeated Cahill, was it obvious that Byrne was going to be the next governor?
I believe so, yes. And I remember, we were not a conservative state. I don't think we have been a conservative state. Charlie Sandman was a conservative, and you could not read or hear about him without a comma, a conservative, after his name. And I remember somebody saying something that really should not be material. It really should not have come into play, but they said when Charlie spoke literally, he would speak out of the side of his mouth, right? And he didn't come off well. Of course, we didn't have much television coverage at that time, but when people would talk about him, they would take this into consideration. It shouldn't be a factor, but it was a factor. But I think the comma, a conservative, it was the most dominating thing.
Did Brendan Byrne speak well?
No. Brendan Byrne was a horror. I have to tell you, in those years, from 72 to about 77, when I went to a different paper, I was stationed in the bowels, the basement of the State House, with radio reporters. Right? I was one of the last reporters to come to the State House on a full-time basis back then. And so that listening to Byrne at a press conference was one thing. Hearing him on tape, and the radio reporters were always playing tapes of him and scratching their heads, how they can get his almost after every sentence, every word. He was not a good speaker. Surprisingly, when he would leave government, he really became polished. The ers were hardly ever there anymore. He was a sought-after dinner. He became a sought-after dinner speaker. His timing was impeccable in the way he delivered lines, funny lines. A huge transformation. I'm not sure when that actually took place, but it certainly from his early days as governor to when he ended his term, two terms, there was a dramatic change.
So he did get much better during the course of 8 years.
Yes, and when he was through, he became terrific.
Let's talk about his first term as governor. What stands out?
I'd rather take that question to some extent to 2 terms, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
What stands out about his first term is that he just didn't care. He didn't care how people reacted to him. He didn't try to pave the way, some public relations stuff regarding an income tax, his income tax proposal. Within a few weeks after promising or suggesting that he would not go for an income tax, there he was going for it. Within a few weeks, there he was pushing for an income tax. And at the very time he was pushing for an income tax, first few months in office, a crucial vote was coming up on the income tax in the Senate, I believe, and he went on a trip. Other governors you would think would stay in the State House, he knew he didn't have the votes probably, stay in the State House, pressure folks to come along with him, give some guidance and support for senators or legislators who were backing his tax, who would get a lot of flap. Hey, your governor is off someplace else, and he's leaving you here to take the hard vote. Things like that. He just didn't care. Sometime I recall one time when he called a press conference and announced he now had the votes in the Senate, and I wrote that day, I could have written that night, that he only had 18 when he needed 21. So he finessed things. I recall and again, right now at this point, I'm talking about his first term, his early years in his first term. I recall a senator saying at that time that senator may have been an assemblyman, later became a senator. I'm not sure what position he had at that. As I'm talking right now, he went in to see Byrne. It was the man was reluctant to vote for the income tax, and he started talking to Byrne, and he said, Brendan Byrne just took a ball and kept on throwing it up. Excuse me. And the legislator said, at one point I said, what do you want me to do? And Brendan Byrne just threw it up, threw the ball at him. During a gas shortage, huge gas shortage, it was 76 or 77. Still probably in his first term or just beginning his second term, he thought nothing about, let me back up, I shouldn't say thought nothing. What he did was to fly into Yankee Stadium on a helicopter during a gas crisis to catch a game there. Another time I believe it was during a National Governors Conference in Washington. He flew the helicopter to Washington, had a state police driver drive the governor's car to Washington so he can have the car while he's in Washington. And then, of course, the state trooper drove the car back, empty, and Brendan flew back by helicopter. Those things are juicy stories for the press, and they make juicy reading too. It gets up the hackles of people when they read that. He wants me to pay more taxes. He has me paying more taxes, but there he is wasting gasoline. Why I have to wait in line every other day to get gasoline?
Do you think today a governor might fly to, a New Jersey governor might fly to Washington and have the state police bring his car down? Or, I mean, maybe it's more acceptable today than it was back then. What do you think?
I think Brendan didn't care. I think while that may happen today, but that governor would be advised by his folks, don't do this. Right? Be careful. There's much more sensitivity to things like that.
Brendan, when you say he didn't care, he did what was best for him regardless of appearance, or he really didn't care whether the public liked him or not?
I think he really didn't care whether the public liked him because he got such flack from the very beginning. Again, 3 or 4 weeks into office, he's pushing for an income tax after seemingly promising he wouldn't do anything like that. So he became the butt of negativism almost immediately, and he couldn't do anything about that. So he was going to enjoy the trappings of office, probably. Again, I'm reading into his head, and that may be unfair. But The public didn't like him. The Meadowlands racetrack opened, and he was introduced. There were 40,000 people at the event, and there were 40,000 people suddenly booing him. They may have also, we got this nickname OTB. I can't recall if they screamed or was screaming out of reporting on it, OTB, OTB, but they certainly were booing him. 40,000 people as he stood up.
I think we've heard in other interviews for this project that that was the same day that the income tax was first withheld from people's paychecks.
It's possible, but the anger was long before that. Long before that.
The helicopter, that became a real element of the Byrne story, didn't it? Using the helicopter?
Using the helicopter was an adjunct to the income tax, the anger over the income tax. All those helicoptered gasoline things that he would do where it seemed like he didn't care, all tied into the income tax, the anger over the income tax.
And now 30 years later we have blue ribbon commissions recommending that the governor use a helicopter more often so that he doesn't have to speed up and down state highways. It's kind of ironic.
Yeah, events change things, of course, over 30 years, 40 years. But you also have blue ribbon commissions recommending things and setting the track for change that governors want. So just be careful. You have to evaluate what commissions are saying and whether they're and what their motivation is. That particular one may be true. But then again, state police don't have to speed at 80, 90 miles an hour.
We're referring to.
I recall one instance with Tom Kane, which is off the subject, but where I happened to be behind a state police car, the governor's car, and they passed me, and I said, gee, what? And I sped up to get an idea of what they were doing, and I stopped probably at 80, 85. And what I did was to go to the deputy chief of staff, Tom Kane's deputy chief of staff, and say, hey, look, here's what I saw. And when I got back to the State House, I checked the governor's schedule. There's no reason me speeding back. So I'm telling you this. You may convey, I would hope you would pass it on to the troopers, because next time I'm going to have a big story about it.
You didn't write that one?
Didn't write it, no. There was no need to write that at that time, as long as the message got across.
And I should just say for the record that we're alluding to the current governor, Corzine, who had an accident in April of this year, traveling at 90 miles per hour.
Okay.
What were Byrne's relations with the legislature like?
Often hostile, because he was trying to beat individuals over the head who did not want to vote for an income tax, who believed that if they voted for an income tax, they'd get killed politically. So you had a lot of anger, flexing of muscles, independence. He did things that were a little nutty, politically nutty, I think. He didn't make friends. He didn't make friends when he went on vacation, when he had an early vote scheduled on the income tax. And he certainly didn't make friends when there was a battle over the budget, huge battle over the budget, and he couldn't get the... this was also had a tie-in with the income tax, because the Senate wasn't moving on the tax. And the Senate sent him a budget, and he decided he would veto, I believe, $480 million. Somebody would have to check the facts, whether it's 480,000 or 480 million. I can't recall, but it was a big chunk at that time. Okay, and he sent one of his aides, Charlie Corella, into the Senate to bull his way through the doors of the Senate, knock down a top nonpartisan aide named Sam Alito, the father of today's justice, knocked down this elderly man, who may have been my age, by the way. We seemed elderly at the time, and then run up to the podium to deliver this veto message, totally unnecessary, and that got the senators angry. Why not? No need for that. It was drama. It was meant as drama, but I think it was misplaced drama.
Who were the key legislators of the time?
Pat Dodd, Frank Pat Dodd out of Essex County was the Senate president early on. Matthew Feldman out of Bergen County, a senator, would become the Senate president. Joseph Merlino, I'm crossing Merlino with M-E-R-I, was the Senate president another time. These are the folks who guided his programs, some of their own too, through the Senate. Dodd was not always in Burns' corner. Was more of an independent guy. Feldman was in Burns' corner because Feldman was Matthew Feldman. Bergen County Senator was a staunch income tax supporter. He often joked, and it's a line that you would hear at the State House, he never saw a tax he didn't like. That can apply to some other people too, but so Feldman was helpful, and Merlino was a very strong, somewhat independent guy, but could bring the senators around to his way of thinking.
Merlino was from Trenton.
Yes, Mercer County.
You say that Feldman was strong on the income tax. Feldman was sort of famous as a liberal. Was Byrne considered a liberal because
Yes.
he was pushing for an income tax?
Yes, Byrne was considered a liberal for a number of things. Before I spoke about, I really like to talk about him in his two terms. I'm going to give you my impression of him as a reporter. Negative, because of all these side things he did. Very negative, and often would write negative pieces about him. Hopefully they were well earned and documented. Even to the point where Brendan Lady and years later would say, "You took a lot of shots at me, Harvey." And then somewhere into his second term, I should have done this before, but somewhere into his second term, I took a look at, I was writing a side for some small publication, a column, and I took a look at what he had accomplished, and it was enormous. He got postcard registration early on, public financing of gubernatorial campaigns, an income tax, homestead rebates. You can go on and on. The preservation of the a million acres of the pinelands, a change in the way hospitals are to how long that they keep patients. It's based on the kind of things that people don't even know, based on the kind of ailments the patient had, 2 days, 3 days. Of course, you can go over if you had to. Joseph Merlino, the Senate president, was a key in that one. There is so much he accomplished. It's beyond any governor I've seen. The bottom line is the personality is one thing. The doer is so much greater than the personality. Personality today is nice. Back then, it was negative. But the list, I have a paper in my hand I put together last night just out of my own head, which I can go over if you like. But they're just naming the things he did. It's
Do you have it on paper?
Yeah, the
Go
list
ahead.
this is probably.
Read your list.
Okay. Well, before he became governor, and while he was the, I guess, governor-elect, he and the existing governor played an instrumental role in getting the financing for the Sports Authority, the Meadowlands Stadium. The New York banks were trying to torpedo the project, and Byrne stood up with Cahill and got New Jersey banks to put up the money. Huge, as a sports complex would become a key part of New Jersey's operation. A huge thing. He would later get the arena, help get the arena. The Sports Authority people were his people. He later get an arena built there, sometime named after him. Sometime later named after him. Again, a huge mistake, by the way, on the personality part. The postcard registration I've mentioned. I've mentioned public financing of gubernatorial campaigns, the opening of Atlantic City. He fought for that. He fought for casino gambling in Atlantic City. And he, during his term, to the best of my knowledge, before Atlantic City even got its first casino, he was down there making a famous speech there telling the mob to keep out. And to the best of my knowledge, the mob was pretty well kept out during his term. The Pinelands was huge. He did the Pinelands before the federal government did the Pinelands. Education funding, in those days it was the lawsuit called Robinson versus Cahill. The name has changed since, but he got, through the income tax, he got that ball rolling by providing, in those days, it would seem like a pittance today, but in those days it was $300 million to implement Robinson versus Cahill education funding changes, where more money would go to the urban areas. Homestead rebates I mentioned, an important political thing. Just before an election, people would get checks in the mail. Huge, very politically astute in that regard. Hardly ever Dean talked about, but he was part of the huge changes, huge revamping of the state's criminal code very early in his administration. The appointment of a Chief Justice, Robert Willents, who would then head the court for many years and make huge decisions that often received nationwide attention. I should say that Robert Willents was the son of David Willents, who was a Middlesex County Democratic leader and national leader, enormous clout in Democratic circles, and a key going back to Brendan Byrne, the Southern candidate, a key to Brendan Byrne's movement towards the nomination was when David Willents dropped his support of a fellow Middlesex County Democratic senator.
Who was that?
Craybill, and switched to Brendan Byrne. And 3 or 4 years later, Brendan Byrne, connection or not, would be appointing Robert Willents, the son to the former assemblyman, one-term assemblyman, Robert Willents, to the Supreme Court as Chief Justice. A little side note on that one.
How would you rank Byrne among the governors you've covered and observed?
By far, number one.
Wow.
That list goes on.
Yeah, I'll keep going.
He was able to get a number of Republicans at different stages to vote for the income tax, which is unusual. Doesn't happen today. Tom Kean was one of them. Wayne Dumont, a senator. Tom Kean, the assemblyman. Wayne Dumont, a senator, a conservative senator who had run for governor in the 60s, 65, I believe, came aboard on the income tax. He took on party bosses. This guy who liked to travel a lot also didn't dodge a fight. The man he named as state Democratic chairman, Jim Dugan. If you recall, I said Dugan came into marched in with Brendan Byrne, who was a senator then, not the senator then. Byrne would get him, Dugan named state Democratic chairman, and then Dugan would turn on Byrne. Income tax again, the anger over him. He fought Dugan, won. And the strong man, strong party boss in Essex County, Burns County, was Harry Lerner. Byrne took on Harry Lerner and won. He stood staunchly against the death penalty, always saying he'll veto if it comes his way. And death penalty in those days was a very popular thing. The man who would later become acting governor Richard Cody, who was an assemblyman back in those days, was pushing the death penalty. Today, Richard Cody is against the death penalty. So he stood his ground on a lot of things. I talked about the hospital payment formula that was very important, though it didn't get a whole lot of publicity. Excuse me. His probably biggest mistake, I think I've read where he says this is not being heavy-handed with Atlantic City at the very outset. Once he got the referendum on Atlantic City, I'm told that people pushed him to take over Atlantic City or have his own people in Atlantic City run the show. Some form of that. He didn't do it. Perhaps for political reasons, he didn't do it. And Atlantic City would be dormant then, other than gambling, for many, many years. It's just now beginning to get some development. It's just now synchronizing its traffic lights. I mean, you're talking about local government being local yokel, being impeding the progress. Whereas if Byrne had put his own people in there, by whatever means, I don't think that would have transpired, and would have. I think Atlantic City would be much better today. And when we talk about Atlantic City, we talk about the poor people and renewal and housing, but it just goes. I'm talking something as simple as synchronizing traffic lights. I use that as a symbol of Atlantic City's backward way. So it's not just lack of housing and giving something back to the people of Atlantic City. It's not just the corruption that ensued for years and years from one administration to another administration. Atlantic City, it's synchronizing traffic lights and things like that. Just basic government.
You've given us the broad sweep of 2 terms. However, after the first term, very, very few people thought he could get reelected. Were you surprised that he won a second term?
I attended the Democratic National Convention, the presidential convention in New York in 1976. And I spent much of my time talking to New Jersey Democrats, delegates, and other bigwigs there. And I came back and I wrote the story that Brendan Byrne's dead. He'll never get nominated. Obviously wrong. He got lucky by pure luck, or maybe he orchestrated. I'll never know. But there were a lot of candidates for the Democratic nomination. And they split the vote, and Brendan Byrne won. And he goes on to the general election. How could maybe he won by luck or whatever, but he's going to get killed by this state senator named Ray Bateman, who was popular as all hell with the press. The press there. Bateman would play basketball with the reporters. Bateman always joke around against this non-personality Byrne. It's a little unfair when I say non-personality, but I'm talking about the comparison. Lively, happy-go-lucky guy. Everybody liked him. Brendan Byrne, all sorts of baggage from his first term. And Byrne Byrne stood up. I think before I talked about that candidates say one thing and then they do something after. Byrne stood up and said this was necessary. Bateman dodged it and came out with some cockamamie ideas or something like that that people perceived as being off the wall or not truthful. So candor in his second election won Byrne a second term, and by quite a majority.
Do you think that there's a universal lesson there that candor carries the day, or this was a particular circumstance? I
think it was a particular circumstance, and I think candor can carry the day in a second term, not in a first term. People will get used to the guy, and they might think differently. Well, the better of two evils and so forth. I think Byrne won an election on the better of two evils. Okay, but I don't think candor would have served Byrne well in his first election, or any governor, because you've had the governors since, with one exception, Whitman. Every governor since saying words to the effect that they would not raise taxes, and then they raised taxes. Whitman didn't raise taxes; he just went the bonding route, which is as evil as evil is the wrong word, which is as bad as raising taxes, because in effect it becomes a tax increase down the road.
Do you think that someone like Brendan Byrne, in style and persona, could get elected governor in New Jersey today?
Obviously, it depends on who he's running against, but just looking at it in a singular way, it might be tough. Again, he was with he didn't speak that well when he first took office. There was nothing, good-looking man, but there was nothing, no great personality emerging. He could have, looking at it singularly, not who he's facing, he could have a hard time. As of course, there's television coverage today. There wasn't really television coverage back then. Yep.
How does he compare to John Corzine, the current governor, who also has a tentative delivery, speaking delivery? He also has as you put it. How do those two? Is there any? Are they cut from similar cloth to some extent, or not?
Both liberals. Both didn't have much experience, electoral experience. But I have to give you a very quick disclaimer. I've never covered face-to-face Corzine, so that the view I'm expressing right now, that may not be that valid. However, if you have money, if you have an enormous amount of money and you're willing to put it into one of the bad things about today's world, political world, and you're willing to use that money, you can win an election no matter how you have, in most cases. What I just said could sound like a negative, a shot, if you will, at Corzine. I don't mean it that way. I think it's just looking at the lay of the land. That's the way the land lays.
You can buy an office.
You can buy an office. Yeah, you can buy an office, an awful amount of publicity. Your name, you can go into an election with no name recognition and come out with everybody knowing your name. You can buy an election. Doesn't always happen. I think there was an enormous amount of money spent a few years ago in an Ohio race, and that millionaire didn't win. But the pace has been set.
In retrospect, what were Brendan Byrne's major mistakes in his first attempts to get an income tax?
The reading at the time, and even perhaps today, was that he didn't pave the way. He did it too quickly. He didn't sell the idea properly. That would be the reading. In retrospect, I think that there were senators and assembly people who wouldn't vote for an income tax no matter what. It took him 2 years. That's one of his pluses. He never gave up. Also, one of his negatives, he angered legislators. Been doing that for 2 years, but he never gave up. And he got what he wanted in the end. Like he dealt with the politicians and some of the bosses, but in the end, they took him on, and he won. Persevered.
He persevered. Did he also get better at politics during that first term, do you think? Or at being governor?
Oh, at being governor, the list I gave you was just enormous. No governor compares to anything like that. Comes even close. He was all over the lot on so many different subjects, and you did not realize it. The reporter didn't realize, I said before, didn't realize it. They were coming singularly, right? And then then when you look at the total record, it is huge.
How about Tom Kean? Compare the two. Kean succeeded.
Tom Kean was the nice guy. Overstating. Brendan Byrne might have been Governor Evil. Tom Kean was, by the way, was a lousy speaker at the beginning. With the 3 months having gone out, he changed too. A lot of the governors change when they go out a lot and speak. Tom Kean would spend, even when he was running for election, might spend an hour with one person, and we in the press with one potential voter. We in the press would laugh at that, right? He's wasting his time. He is not following and doing what politicians should do. They should move from one avenue to the next avenue, one side to the next side. Keep it going. Meet as many people as you can. Kean would stop, and he talked to somebody. He talked to somebody about the theater or whatever it might be. And after a while, I think this came across to folks. He was just a nice guy, interesting guy. Brendan Byrne, probably because he was a Democrat, got the black vote. Tom Kean, a Republican, got the black vote. That's beyond imagination.
Kean was a more appealing personality?
Tom Kean, personality. Tom Kean can go into a black church, right, and he'd appear normal, not out of place.
Could Brendan Byrne do that?
I don't think so. That may be unfair, but Kean was natural.
Some say that Byrne's top staffers, like Dick Leone and Lou Caden, were arrogant. What was your experience?
They were a little arrogant. I had this one story with Caden, about Caden. I followed him into New York, where he was living. The top staffer, he was the governor's counsel. He was living in New York and being chauffeur-driven into New York and back every day. And I wrote this story. What was taking place, and I remember his comment was, "You think a reporter would have something better to do?" Yeah, they were pushy. They were tough guys.
Smart guys?
Yes, absolutely. He had Charlie Corella again, strong arm guy in the Senate, but he had some good people.
John Degnan?
Degnan was relatively, in his first term, was sitting assistant counsel, later would become counsel, and then attorney general. He was perhaps 30, 32. They were all fairly young at the time. Degnan also came out of the Essex County, I think the same town as Brendan Byrne, if I'm not mistaken. Degnan would become a pretty good guy, pretty good official. I'm not sure, however, about his role in his clout, where he stood in the hierarchy of people Brendan might be listening to in that first term, or the beginning of the first term.
Leon was the treasurer, Caden was the counsel, Corella was...
Executive assistant or something like that.
They were the three key ones that you recall?
Yeah. Well, he also had Jerry English, who was his legislative counsel in that office. And that's probably in the main office. He'd bring on some very good people in his second term.
Who?
Howard Hollis, Mulcahy. He would eventually send Mulcahy over to the Sports Authority, and Mulcahy did an outstanding job there for many years.
How was Byrne as a campaigner second time round, 77? Better?
A little bit better. Again, there was hostility to him.
You worked for Jim Florio as
Yes.
assistant treasurer. Talk about a governor who raised taxes and there was hostility toward him. There's nobody in modern times, or at least in our time, who engendered more hostility as governor than Jim Florio. Compare the Byrne tax hike experience and the Florio tax hike experience, could you?
First of all, they both were gutsy guys. I mean, again, Florio did the same thing as Byrne, words to the effect he wouldn't raise taxes, then shortly thereafter moved to raise taxes by an enormous amount. They were little different situations, the political situations, the internal situations. Brendan Byrne was confronted with legislators, and as was Florio, legislators who thought that their political careers would be over if they voted for an income tax and were just going to fight him down tooth and nail. Florio was confronted with a split legislature, not in numbers, but in what I'm about to talk about. And that is, you had the Assembly leadership saying they would not accept a sales tax unless there was an income tax at the same time. You had the Senate leadership wanting just a sales tax. So you had this behind-the-scenes battling going on, and ultimately Florio went for the biggest tax, combined sales and income tax, in the state's history. You had a much more aggressive press with Florio and his taxes and some of the things he did, anti-gun legislation. His people decided they'd push an anti-gun bill before anything, as a test to see how much clout he had, and they got it through. But now they headed towards the income tax and sales tax with the gun lobby up in arms. Okay, and you had this different changing press. Florio became an easy shot. Some of them took that easy shot to the ultimate. The Asbury Park Press actually ran a front page piece with a map showing protesters how to get to the State House. Brendan Byrne didn't. There was just anger, deep-rooted anger throughout the state with Brendan Byrne. But here you had anger being nurtured in a way that Brendan Byrne didn't face. Brendan Byrne, in his second term, stood up and said this was the way to go. Florio truly felt that. he didn't go out and say it. Maybe because he would have gotten a lot of shots in that.
Harvey, you started to tell us a story about an inauguration and a dinner.
Yeah, it's more about kind of a David Wilentz anecdote. It was at the first inauguration. There was the inauguration ball, and then there was a cocktail party for the heavy hitters. That cocktail party was, in those days, we're talking 1974, 1973, was $500 a plate. That was big money at the time. And a few press people were invited. You want to ask me about the trappings of the press, and that's one example of it. A few press people were invited with their spouses, and I remember Betty and I, my wife, were there. And there was this bowl, this silver bowl with shrimp, huge, huge shrimp. Big bowl with huge, huge shrimp. And there was the wife of David Wilentz standing in back of the bowl, and I remember her saying, at $500, I'm not moving from here.
When you think back to the period of the fight over the income tax, really a 2.5-year fight, well, you started to tell us off camera, just a visual image you remember about a senator.
Yep, there was a Senator Joseph Herkler out of Passaic County. He may also have been the Democratic chairman in that county at the time. I'm not really certain, but he was a state senator, and he was adamant against the income tax. And I remember during one debate on the income tax in the Senate, he debated the income tax. There was a ledge that one of the floors of the State House, right near Press Row, and he went out on the ledge, got a chaise lounge from someplace, took off his shirt, and was sunning himself as this heated debate took place in the Senate. And some lucky photographer got a picture of that. It was across the pages of the state press. But that was showing his disdain, and no way were they ever going to get him to vote for an income tax, especially an anti-tax Passaic County, where the local newspapers were vigorously against any tax increase.
Who else do you remember during that time? Think back to that time.
There was Senator Joseph Molino. In this instance, he was. I do not believe he was. He would later become Senate President, but in this particular circumstance, he was the chairman of the Joint Committee on the Budget, Joint Appropriations Committee. And that committee would meet maybe 20 times from March to sometime in May. And go over the budget and retool the budget and make some changes. In the end, they only made a small amount of changes. But at any rate, we got wind that he had taken the committee members to a local pub, and they would eat there every night, and they run up big bills. You would never see alcohol, just say drinks, and then the amount was in a. One of those days was something like $900, $1,000. Again, that was big money at the time. And we then confronted the Senator Molino. How could you do this? Why, this isn't right. You're eating on state taxpayers are paying for this, and so forth. And his quote was, "I'll never forget. What do you want me to do? Take him to McDonald's?"
Was it Lorenzo's?
It was Lorenzo's, yeah. That's the place where all the pals would gather. I remember when I was working for the Elizabeth Journal and doing a lot of local coverage as opposed to statewide coverage. Did some of that too, but a lot of local. I would watch local coverage, so I'd really watch the the senators and the assembly people from Union County. Really watch them. And if they introduce some dinky, stupid, meaningless bill, I'd still write about it in just a very straightforward manner. And one day, all 4 assembly people from Union County got up and walked out while the session was still going on. So since I wrote anything they did, I wrote about that too, right? And that was on a Monday, and the next time they were back in session, one of those legislators confronted me and said, "Why did you do that? Why do you do something like that?" And I said, "Well, I write about this, I write about that, I write about everything you guys do." He said, "You really got me in trouble." I said, "What do you mean I really got you in trouble? Voters are angry?" "No," he says, "my wife is angry. She just wanted to know where I went." When I went to a party. There was a assemblyman and later senator named Freeland, David Freeland. And I wrote about him, again probably for the Elizabeth Journal, even though he's from Hudson County, out of my area. I wrote that he didn't show, or again walked out for an important vote. Probably with David Freeland, it wasn't going with a party to a party. With him, it was probably he didn't want to be recorded on that particular vote. So he was a scheming kind of guy. He would later get in big trouble with the law. He said, the next day or next week, he said to me, unrelated to that, he said, "Why don't you go out to dinner with us?" Reporters didn't think much about that, going out for dinner. And I went out to dinner with him to a restaurant that a lot of people would go to off Route 1. I don't remember the name of it anymore. It was off Route 1 heading north about 10 minutes outside of the State House. And there were a lot of legislators there, and I sat at a table with Friedland, and I was cutting into a steak I was having, and we were talking. He says, "You know, I can't understand how people knew I skipped out on that vote." I cut into the steak, and I said, "David, I wrote it." That's some of the trappings of the office or the position of reporter. Interestingly, as much negative stuff I wrote about Byrne, and maybe even felt that he was doing things wrong at the beginning, I still was happy to get invited at Christmas time to Morven, which was the state governor's residence at the time. It was a feel-good. I could tell my friends I went to Morven and so forth. So there was kind of a two-faced, double-faced aspect to that. I was happy to get invited to inaugural balls. Right? That was the climate at the time. I don't know if it's changed. I suspect it hasn't, but I don't know.
Well, as someone who's still in the press corps, I would say it probably has not, although different reporters bring different standards to the job, and there are some who wouldn't go out with a legislator for dinner for fear of
being co-opted.
Yeah.
You want to take a break?
Sure. Harvey, let me ask you about some of the key legislators back then, and just tell us what you remember of them. Matty Feldman.
A wonderful man, nice man, was able to somehow bring the Senate to a vote on an income tax, which was amazing. Very liberal, was one of the few who would consistently vote behind closed doors to get rid of senatorial courtesy with whoever, with the Democratic majority in their caucus. The vote would often come out to be whatever number to 3 to get rid of the senatorial, and that's never going to happen.
Al Burstein.
Al Burstein was brilliant, smart, played a huge role with a senator named Wiley, Stephen Wiley, in fashioning the education funding law, in answer to Robinson versus Cahill, the thorough and efficient attack on education spending, based on thorough and efficient words in the Constitution. Brilliant, smart, but unfortunately didn't necessarily have the clout to bring other legislators with him. They listened, they'd hear him talk, but when it came to vote, he didn't have it. He was at some point he was the Assembly majority leader, and a majority leader has to be able to bring the troops along with him. He often didn't.
Jim Dugan.
But a very well-respected man.
Jim Dugan.
Jim Dugan, a character, stood with Brendan Byrne, stood against Brendan Byrne. I remember asking the question at some gathering, what makes you powerful? At that time, he was really taking on Brendan Byrne to the point where Jimmy Carter, running for president, didn't know if he should be buttering up Brendan Byrne, the governor, or Jim Dugan, the state Democratic chairman. I said, Jim, at a gathering, what makes you powerful? And his answer was the perception of power. If people perceive you're powerful, you're powerful. It was really, I thought, a great answer, candid answer, and would help me in my thinking later on and as a reporter,
That is
analyzing.
That is very interesting. Alan Karcher.
Went from a man, I'm going to use the word conservative. I don't know if he was conservative truly at the time, but a man who took the conservative position as an assemblyman early on, coming from a blue-collar legislative district that encompassed much of Sayreville, early on to get around the Supreme Court's order on education funding by proposing that the words thorough and efficient education be eliminated from the Constitution. He had a bill into that effect. Later, there's a dramatic turnaround, and he becomes an income tax supporter and a clear-cut liberal, and to the point where in years following, he is running in a primary against Jim Florio, a liberal, and Karcher becomes the ultimate liberal in that primary. So a huge turnaround.
Chris Jackman.
Chris Chris came out of Hudson County. He was an assemblyman, became the assembly speaker. Probably because, a very nice guy, everybody liked him. He became assembly speaker probably because he'd been around so long, in part, anyway. One of his traits was, before he became assembly speaker, when he sat in the back of the assembly chamber, was to scream out, "Let's go!" That was Chris. And then there was this wonderful, wonderful story about Chris Jackman when they were debating Little League Baseball and whether little girls should be allowed to play. And Chris stood up and he gave this speech about what's going to happen when there's a play at second base involving a little girl and the tag is made on her lower part.
Ray Bateman.
Very good senator, very respected, got along well with people, was one of the boys with the press, when the press was mainly boys. Did a lousy job as a gubernatorial candidate. He was perceived to be a likely winner, lost big time. He was, I believe, the first Senate president to hold that office more than one term. And now, that's set the pace now. If you play your cards right, you could be Senate president or Assembly Speaker for life, just like New York, if you play your cards right and your party maintains control.
Steve Wiley.
much like Al Burstein, very smart, could make a great speech, liberal. An accident. He was an accident. His election was an accident because of Brendan Burns' victory. That when Brendan Burns took along his coattails, took along all sorts of people, including Wiley, who came out of Morris County, heavily Republican Morris County. So Wiley was an accident. And then Wiley, interestingly, could have been, was Brendan's nomination to be Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court. But it turned out Wiley had voted for an increase as a senator for the judiciary, and therefore couldn't be constitutionally couldn't be appointed to the court, and it's a heartbreak. By the way, I'm not sure if it was Chief Justice or just Justice.
Tom Kane.
Tom Kane, enchanting, very nice man. He had an answer for everything. And I don't say that, although what I'm about to say may come off as sarcastic. I'd say it's 25% sarcastic. And that he had an answer for everything, so therefore he didn't invoke a lot of press criticism. He had quotes. He could be quoted. He may not be directly on point, and it may not be a strong quote, but he had an answer, which way, by the way, is a brilliant way of dealing with things. In the long run, it may not be great for the state, but politically is a very good way of dealing with things.
You're saying to come up with a quote beforehand, to fashion some phrase, some line?
Whether it's beforehand or comes off at the moment, doesn't make a difference. He responded. And again, he had this ability to talk to people. He and I had a very good relationship because as we, in effect, were contemporaries. When he was an assemblyman, I was a reporter. And in part, since the Elizabeth Journal covered a little bit of Essex County, I would cover him a lot. So we got to know each other. And we could sometimes talk on a different basis than reporter to governor. I had this thing, it may sound a little egotistical, but for the anecdote, it's important. I had this thing that I would ask a question, and when I got from a governor at a press conference, when I got non-answer, so to speak, I'd say, with all due respect, Governor, I don't think you have responded to the very question I asked, so let me try again. Okay, and it was effective. It was effective when you do that out in the open, and you choose to do it at the right time, not all the time. Okay, so one day we're meeting in the hall, and the two guys, the reporter who used to know him, the assemblyman, now the governor, were chatting, and he said, "Harvey, I got to tell you something. When those words, with all due respect, Governor, come out of your mouth, I feel like somebody is putting their finger right into my chest." Right?
That's good. Wayne Dumont.
Very quiet, contemplative guy, hard to read, did come around from being a staunch conservative, no tax guy, to one day I remember speaking to him in the cafeteria of the State House saying, we need to do more, we need more money. This is the man who had wanted to eliminate a lot of departments of state government, and at that point he was coming out for a sales tax increase, which was a gutsy thing to do. But he was a name in his Sussex County, Sussex-Warren County, where he came from, well respected.
Do you think New Jersey's image changed during the Byrne years, its image nationally?
No. I think despite having done an awful lot, I don't think the image changed. There was still a lot of viewed a lot of views that people didn't like him, etc., etc. The naming of the Brendan Byrne Arena, the arena after Brendan Byrne. There was one paper, my paper actually, the Record of Hackensack, the Bergen Record, would run polls almost every day of people. Do you think the name should be Brendan Byrne? The arena should be named after Brendan Byrne. He did things like that, but that was Byrne's character. On the same token, we did become much more nationally known because we had a very active Supreme Court making some very important decisions. We had the Meadowlands hosting major sporting events, teams coming to the major teams in New Jersey. So that, I would say that changed. I'm going to back off what I said before. That did change New Jersey's image to some extent. The real image change came with Tom Kane.
The image changes came with Kane.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How so? Expand on that.
Kane promoted the state. He went around talking about the state. There was more action from him about tourism. Maybe from a political standpoint, he appeared on tourism ads, but they were being watched. Democrats hated it, but they were still effective. We just became better known nationally and more respected. That's probably his greatest achievement. And that may sound sarcastic, but it is not meant to be sarcastic in any way. And he brought people together. There was a lot of hostility in the Byrne years, lingering into his second term. But now with Kane, blacks, whites, Republicans, Democrats came together.
You've talked about Robinson versus Cahill. In hindsight, given the contentiousness of that issue as it became Abbott versus Burke and up through the next 3 decades, does it look in hindsight like the Supreme Court overreached when it shut the schools?
In hindsight, it could look that way. A court becoming far too active. But if you think about a Supreme Court decision that came in 93 or 94, I think 93, Supreme Court, and then a decision on education funding that had been, did I say 93? I'm sorry. That would have been, no, that would have been, what year did that?
There have been so many Abbott v. Burke rulings that it's hard to know.
73 or 74 is when the decision came down from the Supreme Court. There was the, and that had been, that had come from the trial courts. Theodore Botta was a judge who had ruled probably in 1971 regarding education funding. So if you use that time frame, from 71 to trial courts, 73 or 74 would be the court decision. Brendan Byrne is now in office, 74, and advocating, but nothing happens until the schools are closed, I believe, in July of 1976 or thereabouts, a 2.5-year frame. If you look upon it that way, then the court could be viewed as having a lot of patience and deciding that that something has to be done. And within a couple of days after the court moved to close the schools, the Senate did vote.
Do you remember that time? Do you remember?
Sure, those were all-night sessions.
Were they?
Yeah, they. In those days, you could reporters were on the floor of the legislature. They can go right into the well of the Senate chamber or the Assembly chambers and talk to legislators at different times, almost at any time. You did it quietly. You knee down when you did talk, and we would go up to Assembly Democrats would have a caucus, and they come up thinking they have the votes. And then we'd go to the people who we thought were negatives who may be changing and being positives. And we'd say, what about it? How are you going to vote? And those sessions would go on for, I think the last one out of the assembly went on to 6 o'clock in the morning. And there was, I cannot remember the man's name, unfortunately, but he was an assemblyman who stood up that day and said, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker. And the speaker says, why do you stand, Assemblyman so-and-so? And he said, I stand to aerate my undershorts. Quirky things like that would happen. It was hot. There was no, my recollection, there's no air conditioning in the assembly chamber. I came to a realization as a reporter that I should not ask legislators how they were going to vote after they came up from their caucus.
Why?
I realized that while they may have bent and made a decision in the caucus, when their local, I emphasize local, reporter confronted them, they get cold feet.
You didn't want to change.
So what I was having an impact on the process that a reporter shouldn't have.
Huh.
I would rather wait until after the vote. After longest time I did it beforehand, but then I came to this realization. I decided to wait until afterwards to get their explanations.
That's interesting. You could help pass the income tax by refraining from asking a local legislator how he's going to vote.
Possibly.
Okay. Byrne appointed.
But then again, I could help kill the income tax by raising that same question, which should not be the motivation, one way or the other, of a reporter.
Byrne appointed 3 of his counsels to the Supreme Court. In your view, does this make the court too cozy with the executive, too pro-executive in its dealings with the legislature, in terms of equality of the branches?
An argument can be made that people with judicial experience, Alan Handler would have been one of those counsels who had judicial experience. I believe he was an appellate division judge beforehand. The argument could be made that people with judicial experience should be appointed to the court rather than the negative word would be cronies. That's an unfair term, but that's the way some people would view it because they don't have judicial experience. I'm not sure personally that you need judicial experience to be a member of the high court. It's what's in your head, what your attitudes are, your fairness, your reputation for fairness, independence. We, by and large, have had even though that's going on, it went on in other administrations, now with Byrne, appointing people close to you without judicial experience to the courts. It went on with Whitman. Okay. We've had a pretty good court.
Robert Wilentz didn't have judicial
experience.
No,
Robert Wilentz was an assemblyman who, at the time he was appointed to the Supreme Court, was a lobbyist for the liquor industry. Okay. But
what was your impression of Wilentz?
Gutsy guy, could stand up, easily would anger folks. Sometimes he undercut his own judiciary, and they were for what a trial judge did or something. They would be angry with him. Stood up for when an appellate division judge was up for reappointment, and she was being opposed by Senator Cardinale of Bergen County, stood up for her, even to the point, I remember writing about it, meeting with senators in the back room of a bar to discuss how to salvage this appointment.
That was Judge Sylvia Pressler.
Sylvia Pressler, right? Yeah, an interesting anecdote. I believe it was 1980 or thereabouts. I guess the election would have been 81, so maybe it was 80. We at the Bergen Record got this report that he was thinking about running for governor. So we called him. Peter Yerkes, I was the bureau chief at the time, State House bureau chief, and Peter Yerkes was one of my reporters, and I had Peter call Wilentz. Again, both of us knew him because we had backgrounds in Middlesex County as reporters. Peter was once a reporter for the Perth what was then the Perth Amboy paper. I was once a reporter for the Home News in New Brunswick, and this was a former legislator from Middlesex County and the son of the Middlesex County by far most powerful politician. So we had backgrounds with him, so we can talk differently in a different way, kind of, to Wilentz. And I had Peter call him and say, Peter said, "Here's what we're planning to write. We hear you're going to go. What about that?" And he said, "Peter, if you write that, it's going to hurt me as a justice. And I'll tell you, I'm not going. Okay, I'm not going to run." And we accepted that and didn't write the story because we didn't think he would take us. He would say no comment, or he'd smile and crack a joke, but he wouldn't be that definitive. So he didn't write the story. A few days later, we got a call. Peter, it's Wilentz on the phone for you. And Peter said, "Hello?" And Wilentz said, "This is Governor Wilentz."
Cute.
So he had a sense of humor. When I wrote very tough, in a very tough way about him not living in New Jersey, and actually living in New York, he told legislators there was a special Judiciary Committee hearing on his renomination. When he told legislators he'd been living in New York because his wife had breast cancer and she had to be near the doctor. I wrote near her doctor in New York. I wrote that he'd been living in New York long before his wife had breast cancer. And essentially, when I was no longer in the State House, probably about 1994. I believe his reappointment came in '88 or something like that. Was it? I have to take wrong.
It was 87, okay. I believe.
Okay, so in 1994, I saw him, and he said, "You still want to know where I live?" He had carried that.
That was a very dramatic fight, his reappointment fight.
He got one vote. Tom Kean bailed him out by getting a senator named Lee Laskin, a Republican, to provide the one vote Wilentz needed. Laskin later would be named a judge.
Is the New Jersey...
And later Laskin would send me a note when I went to work for the paper. I'm now at the New Jersey Lawyer. Laskin would send me a note saying, "It's about time you got a real job."
Is the New Jersey Supreme Court weaker today than it was in the 70s?
Don't know. There were some issues that confronted the Wilentz court that were gigantic. Certainly education funding, dealing with drunken liquor laws, up and down the line. Huge housing for the poor. It's called Mount Laurel, which had a discriminatory aspect to it, because the suburbs were much of the suburbs were lily white, because of high zoning requirements. The court dealt with those in a very forthright manner. Those issues, by and large, haven't come up. The courts later, in more recent years, have upheld Mount Laurel. They've upheld, we'll see if they continue to do so, the education funding. They dealt with a controversial issue like same-sex marriage. They showed political independence. The courts in more recent times showed political independence by a unanimous vote that hurt Republican chances for a victory in the U.S. Senate race a couple of years ago. That's a much divided, politically divided court being undivided when it came to a politically hot issue like that. So the court has continued to show a non-political vein, even though they all came out of the political arena. That's good, but you'd have to see what emerges in the years ahead. It's beginning to change a little bit.
The Meadowlands, we've talked about a little bit. Given what's happening now with the professional teams, either leaving the Meadowlands or, in the case of pro football, taking over the operation of the stadium, a new stadium from the Sports Authority, is that how do you see the future of what's going to happen up there, and the future of the Sports Authority, the future of the state's investment in that being a showcase?
You know, it's not the showcase. It will not be the showcase it has been. You're still going to have 70,000 or so fans, football fans, coming there every other Sunday, just about every other Sunday during the football season, during the fall anyway. You may get some spin-off in terms of singers, groups, and so forth coming there, some more greater shopping, but the Meadowlands will not be the Meadowlands that it was. It's hard to conceive of that. Down the road, you're going to have to see if there's any, I don't see this happening, if there's any comeback, if you will. If one team doesn't make it in Brooklyn and another team doesn't make it in Newark. By the way, the cultural center in Newark is a huge positive for Tom Kane, and that's another example where the Star Ledger, as we discussed before, showed its clout by running pieces about the need for a cultural center in Newark on front pages and almost coordinating with Kane on that issue, much like the Star Ledger coordinated its efforts to get the Meadowlands back in 1972-73.
That was the Star Ledger of your era under editor Mort Pye.
Yes.
It doesn't campaign for issues quite as strongly today as it used to.
No, it doesn't.
Any other thoughts on Brendan Byrne after the 1977 election?
Just so remarkable how he became this huge humorist, sought after to speak at various events. And when you speak to people nowadays who weren't there back then, they think he's a grand old man, funny, great speaker, far different impression of what the public thought of him back in the 70s.
How were his relations with the press by the end of his 8 years?
Fine. You know, he left office. I don't know the answer to that.
How were his relations with you? How were your relations with him by the end of his 8 years?
Well, I'll tell you. couple of things. I remember him saying to me once, "Hey, Harvey, you took a lot of shots at me." And he said it with a smile on his face.
Did you take a lot of shots at him?
Yes.
Why?
I thought they were deserved. I thought he was doing some nutty, politically silly things, as I recounted before. What they were, taking off when a crucial vote was about to take place, forgetting about the gas crisis and things like that. Just the exteriors of the way he conducted himself as governor are just open for criticism. Okay, but he'd say he took a lot of shots, and I did take a lot of shots at him. He brought it on himself. I once did I forget if I related this before, I once did a Philadelphia TV program where it's taped on a Thursday, shown on a Sunday. It's meeting the governor with a couple of reporters there, and at 15, it's a half hour, 25 minutes, half hour showing, and at the end of 15 minutes, he just got up and said, "Gotta go, gotta catch a plane." Unusual, and he left the place, and the show continued with two reporters who had been somewhat negative of him, talking for the next 15 minutes about negative stuff, bad political move, or he should have canceled out beforehand. So he did nutty, I say that almost lovingly now, nutty things. But as time would pass, at one point we'd laugh. We'd see each other, we'd laugh. At one point, I was sitting in when I was in pre-stint in government, I was sitting in for the state treasurer at a meeting of the Sports Authority, and Brendan Byrne was a member, right? And he made some proposal for a vote on something, and nobody at the time, for whatever reason, seconded the motion. And I remember him leaning forward, looking down at the end of the table to me, and saying, "What's wrong, Harvey? Doesn't the treasurer let you vote?" Later on, when I'm at Public Broadcasting, New Jersey Network, I arrange, it now appears all the time in the Star Ledger, but it originated with New Jersey Network. I brought Tom Kane and Brendan Byrne together for a weekly or every other week talk about some issue or some issues. Both of them would call me and say, "What's going on?" for background, and they'd be prepared to get together. We'd meet on occasion, the two of them, in Essex County, at some restaurant in Essex County, and we talk about things. There was no feeling of lingering hostility. I told him once about a huge problem I was having at New Jersey Network, and both of them began laughing, and they essentially said it couldn't happen to a nicer guy. In other words, now you deal with it.
How has media coverage of governors changed from then until now?
You have, I think you have the whole Watergate thing set in motion investigative journalism on issues that really were not that high profile. And so you've now come to the time where the press is more negative. I've said I was negative in my reporting, but the press is more negative at some issues than existed in the past. At the same time, news gathering in general, all over, is more negative. Some of the talk shows have begun leading the way for the press, for the print press, which at least was more was thought to be more conservative, more legit, and now we're all joining in together. I don't know who's beating the drums.
Is there anything about the current coverage that bothers you?
I think some of the coverage about the governor and his relationship with his former female friend at times is going overboard. I think how much money he gave to her before their relationship ended is ripe for reporting, but not to the extent it has. On the other hand, whether or not he was dealing with her regarding labor issues when he was negotiating a labor contract, that's on point. I think that he's been given, this is the flip side of it, he's been given somewhat of a free ride on his some of the things he promised to do, more housing units for the poor. Hasn't touched that. Excuse me. He's something I watch all the time. He's left 35, 37 judgeships vacant. Whether he's having problems dealing with senators who want their friends or pals or political allies appointed judgeships and they can't get along, that may be the case. But as governor, he can twist arms, and he has the power of the office. And there's been no movement in that regard. I think that by and large, so far, it's been a lackluster governorship. But it took Tom Kean about a year to turn things around. So you have to, the person needs more time.
Last question. What is the role of a newspaper man in a state capital? What are you there for?
Well, obviously I'm there to report what's taking place and there to find out what people don't want me to know, what's taking place. And a good reporter will get 30% of that or 40% of that. What I would call a 9 to 5 reporter who's there from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock and then is going home and not thinking about it anymore might get 15, 20% of what's going on. It's the job of a reporter at the State House is to signal some of the bad things going on and signal some of the good things that are going on and just, if need be, follow the governor's counsel being chauffeur-driven into New York. So that's not the major role of a reporter at the State House, but it is part of the role. It's to point out when you have important questions that are not being answered, to wait 1 or 2 weeks for that answer, and if the answer doesn't come, you do not allow stonewalling to undercut what the questions are. Then you have to bring those questions right in print or on TV and report they're not being answered after 2 weeks, which I've just done in one particular instance. To be aggressive, somewhat aggressive. Basically, reporting what's taking place, but there's a percentage of that role in being aggressive and challenging. Ask the toughest questions. Ask, did you beat your wife questions? Don't hesitate. And then after you got the answer, look at the answer, weigh the answer, decide if you want to report about it.
Very good, Harvey. Thanks very much.
Okay.